with action potentials.
Sounds good.
You're going to figure out what's actually sort of happening within the cell.
All right, so I see you've drawn a membrane there, and I see that there are negative charges inside and positive charges outside.
So it's like at rest.
At rest, okay. So if you're going to draw a graph of the change in potential with time, maybe we should make a picture of that. There's time in milliseconds. Good. And there's potential in volts, millivolts actually. Right? Okay, and you're starting at rest, let's say that's at minus 60 millivolts. And so over time it's just a flat line because as we worked out, that's where the membrane will sit unless you disturb it. Now,
I also drew our positive feedback loop.
Oh, excellent.
Just so that we can incorporate this into what's actually happening.
All right, so let's give the membrane a little bit of a kick. We're going to inject some current, say, and start to depolarize it.
Okay. Here's our injected current.
That's right. And so what happens? Okay, so that starts to move up. What happens across the membrane?
It depolarizes.
Okay, so send the positive that you injected. It cancel out the negatives inside, and then the positives outside go away. Less charge separation. More depolarized. Good. Now what happens?
So we've done this change, and now we have to change the conductance of the sodium.
That's right.
So to do this, we have certain gates.
That's right, which are voltage sensitive.
Okay, so let's talk about the gates. So we have...
There's a fast responding gate, and its name is?
The M gate.
And then you have a slow responding gate, which is called the
H gate.
Good. And then that's for the sodium ions. And then for the potassium, you have another gate, which is called the
N gate.
Good. And so what you've drawn is the M is closed, the H is open, and the N is closed in the resting membrane, roughly. Now again, this is a gross oversimplification. There are many, many channels, and the gates are actually much more complex, but we can start with this to try to understand what's going on. So what happens to an M gate when the membrane is partially depolarized?
Well, if we're going to increase our sodium conductance, the M gate should open.
That's what happens. Exactly. So the M gate opens.
And this allows sodium to flow into the cell.
That's right. So sodium, we have a current of sodium going in. That's that I sodium that you drew here, right, going through these open channels. And what does that do to the charge separation across the membrane?
That's going to depolarize it.
That's right. In fact, it's going to go through zero, where they're all going to cancel out.
So we're going to get rid of all of the charges.
And then it's going to keep going until it gets somewhere close to the Nernst potential that potassium would like, not all the way to plus 55, but on the way there. And now and this is very fast because of the positive feedback loop, and you rise quickly to the peak of the action potential. Maybe you want to clean that up a little bit?
I can clean that up. It's hard to draw on tablets, people. That's great.
Good.
Okay.
Get to the peak of the action potential, and now what happens?
Well, if we don't stop it, it's going to go out of control like an explosion.
Well, we'll get to plus 55 and just hang there and not do anything else.
Nothing interesting would happen. So now we need to decrease the sodium conductance and increase the potassium.
All right, so what is excellent. So what decreases the sodium conductance?
Well, let's see. The M gate reacts really quickly.
Right, but it's happy being open. The H gate is very slow, but it actually, in this configuration, it wants to be closed. When the membrane is very positive, like this inside, it wants to close.
The H gate kind of wakes up and says...
Wakes up and slowly closes. And so what happens to the sodium influx?
It stops.
Good. End of sodium influx. Now what happens to the N gate, which is also slow?
This would open, I guess.
It opens.
And this is the, potassium gate.
Right. This is a gate for a channel that permeates potassium selectively. And what does the potassium do? Where is it high?
It's high inside.
So which way does it flow?
It goes outside.
So we get a current of potassium ions leaving the cell. They're pulling out positive charges. What happens to the membrane? Pulling out positive charges. Back through zero as you cancel all those out. And where does the potassium ion want to take the membrane?
Negative 75.
Right, very negative. So in fact, it's going to be more negative, and that excess of polarization on the inside is a
hyperpolarization.
Hyperpolarization, and if we now draw that, we see that it goes beyond rest and goes down. Now, after a time, because it's so hyperpolarized, right? So you're showing us what the rest should be. Mm-hmm. The end gates will shut.
So let's draw that, and that stops the potassium current.
Excess potassium current goes away. Now, we still have the passive channels, which you didn't represent here, but we've gone through that extensively, and they're going to ensure that we go back to the resting potential. So that's flow through other channels that we're not showing here.
Things like the sodium-potassium pump, right?
Well, actually, that would help us if there was a net imbalance. It's actually the passive channels that establish the resting potential. It's the pump that keeps the net fluxes from causing the gradients to break down. Okay. So it'll just be the passive channels that are not gated, and you end up back at rest. And that ends the action potential.
Okay. And that's how that's how we compare all of these three things.
That's right. So let's just label our picture of the action potential. We already know where rest is. That's there. Then we have the rising phase going up. Then we have the peak of the action potential. Then we have the falling phase. Then we have the after hyperpolarization, which we now understand.
And that's saying like after the action potential there is that?
Usually. Now there can be other things that happen if there are more different channels. That will be something to talk about later. And then we're back to rest. And now during the time that you have the after hyperpolarization, what does that mean in terms of how easy it is to fire the action potential?
It's probably really hard because our H gates are mostly still closed,
yep.
right?
Yep.
And then our N gates are open at this point.
That's right.
And so because our H gates are closed, it's hard to activate the
voltage-dependent sodium channels.
And then also because we're hyperpolarized, it's harder to reach the threshold, correct?
Exactly. And the potassium that's running out will tend to shunt any depolarizing current that we inject in. So we're putting plus charges in, and those plus charges are just running out to the potassium channels. Mm-hmm. So if you can't fire an action potential at all, which happens very shortly after, that's called what?
So like this period of time.
Right, it's very short. That's called the refractory period. And if you can't fire at all, that's called the
absolute
refractory period.
So that's like here, right?
Right, that's the absolute refractory period.
And you can't fire because all of the H gates are closed.
You just don't have the wherewithal to do it, and because the N gates are open. So that's the absolute refractory period. Then, as it starts to recover, you have a period where it takes more to fire it, and that's referred to as the relative refractory period.
And that's because, so your H gates have reset, and same with your M gates, but you've just got this huge positive charges leaving this.
Well, they're partially reset, they're not fully reset.
Okay.
And because they're partially reset, you have a larger but not as large a population of sodium channels to draw upon, so it's harder to get the whole positive feedback loop to work. And you still have a population of the voltage-dependent potassium channels that haven't quite shut off, and they're shunting the excitatory current that you're injecting.
Okay.
And that combination makes it harder to generate an action.
So in the absolute refractory period, it's impossible.
Right.
In the relative refractory period, it's just very difficult.
That's the difference.